Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here with us. Distinguished guest, Chairman, Board Director of the Gamini Korea Foundation, Session Chair, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen. In order to start today's session, I would like to introduce our session chair, Mr. Suresh Shah, Director General, State-Owned Enterprise Restructuring Unit, and he's known as a business builder and a strategist. And our panelists will consist of Mr. Mahendra Jayasekara, Managing Director of Lanka Voltiles Limited, Mr. R.H.W.A. Kumarasiri, Director General of the National Planning Department, and Mr. Chandrasena Mariyadda, former Secretary, Ministry of Plan Implementation, Ministry of Southern Region Development, and Ministry of Post and Telecommunication. So today's session will be conducted by Mr. Dhananath Fenando, who is the CEO of the Advocata Institute, and Ms. Rehana Thowfeek, who is a research associate with Advocata. So in order to start today's session, we have a small introductory video about the Gamini Korea Foundation. I hope you'll enjoy it.
The Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, SLIF, is an initiative of the Gamini Korea Foundation aimed at meaningfully contributing towards resolving the complex economic issues confronting the country today. The Gamini Korea Foundation was founded to take forward the passion of Dr. Gamini Korea to achieve just and equitable economic development in all countries. The late Dr. Gamini Korea was an internationally renowned Sri Lankan economist and an outstanding product of the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. Born on the 4th of November 1925 to Dr. C.V.S. Korea and Freda Korea, sister of Sir John Kotalavala, the then Prime Minister of Ceylon. Dr. Gamini Korea's grandfather and granduncle were the famous freedom fighters from Chilo, Victor Korea, who was a member of the Legislative Council of Ceylon, and Charles Korea. His uncle, Sir Claude Korea, was at the forefront of Sri Lanka's entry onto the world stage at the independence and for many years thereafter. Gamini Korea was educated at the Royal College Colombo, after which he started his higher education at the University of Ceylon in 1944, before going to study at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and Nuffield College, Oxford from 1945 to 52. There he obtained 2 BAs and MAs from the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge, and a DPhil from University of Oxford. He was the first Sri Lankan to obtain a doctorate in economics. He was also the first Sri Lankan to obtain a doctorate from Oxford University in any subject. He was a key member of the Planning Committee for Sri Lanka's first 10-year plan, 1959, which sought to raise economic growth and reduce poverty. Among his numerous achievements was his appointment as the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where he negotiated the terms of the Lome Convention, a landmark agreement providing development and access to European markets to Africa and the Caribbean. He was an early proponent of the equitable development who worked tirelessly for trade and development in developing countries. The Gamini Korea Foundation provides opportunities for meaningful economic engagement through rigorous multidisciplinary research to promote inclusive and sustainable development. The Gamini Korea Foundation, an autonomous non-profit institution, is committed to making a real and lasting difference in the lives of vulnerable people. The Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, SLIF, has been conceptualized by Gamini Korea Foundation to bring about change and infuse innovation into the processes of democratic governance and sustainable economic development. It aims to pursue in-depth research and dialogue, focusing on core sectors that need to be addressed, and suggest innovative, results-oriented policy strategies to resolve the current economic crisis. The Sri Lanka Innovators Forum will bring together the like-minded thought leaders and industry stakeholders to discuss, debate, and agree on pressing issues in a variety of sectors and devise alternative, sustainable economic models, processes, and practices. A group of thought leaders who are also subject experts have been assigned to review the issues papers and provide necessary guidance and relevant research material to the respective authors. SLIF will transcend boundaries and barriers and invite specialists from all over the world to contribute their expert views and knowledge to enable Sri Lanka to face its current challenges effectively. 20 identified sectors have been assigned to experts to research and write issues papers on contemporary issues which have an impact on socio-economic development. The discourse will commence with questions that should be raised on good governance and administrative reforms. The other topics are tourism, export-oriented industrial development, macroeconomic policy, poverty reduction, reforming Sri Lanka's state-oriented enterprises, Sri Lanka's electricity and petroleum industry, Sri Lankan food crops, livestock and fisheries, transportation and highways, education, healthcare, shipping and logistics, international trade and investment, subnational policies, environment, women and development, ethnicity and socio-economic development, information technology, and foreign policy. The outcome of these issues papers forms a blueprint to be presented to policymakers as a landmark contribution from the Gamini Korea Foundation towards strengthening the economic recovery of Sri Lanka. You are invited to join the Sri Lanka Innovators Forum by logging on to the Gamini Korea website. Fill in the registration form, choose an area of expertise where you would like to share your knowledge, advice and comments on the issues papers posted under each thematic area. Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, beyond the barriers of tradition.
Thank you very much. Now I have the privilege of inviting our CEO of the Gamini Korea Foundation, Lasitha Devendra, to deliver the welcome speech.
Thank you, Sohan. Good evening to all of you. We welcome you to the Innovators Forum, a discussion on public enterprise reforms written by Mr. Dhananath Fenando on the topic of performing Sri Lankan state-owned enterprises. Dhananath is the CEO of Advocata, supported by Rehana Thowfeek, who's a senior research fellow at Advocata. As the video says, Sri Lanka Innovators Forum is an innovative of the Gamini Korea Foundation, which is an autonomous, not-for-profit organization to promote development in this country. Mission is to contribute into socio-development of Sri Lanka, and especially towards low-income to middle-income families with the research that is required to make this country great. The main objective of the Innovators Forum is to provide evidence-based policy recommendations to the stakeholders, to the administrators of the country, to resolve the current economic crisis. The inaugural review of the SLIF was launched with the blessing of the Prime Minister on 24th of February 23. We are honored to welcome his son. Thank you, sir, for coming at the BMICH. The SLIF has undertaken the task of issuing 20 issues papers on different topics, and today we have the 11th session on performing Sri Lankan state-owned enterprises, which is a very key important area for development. And so we will compile all these 20 papers to a policy paper for the government to consider and move forward. So we welcome all of you to come and actively contribute to our project. Let me thank and welcome Mr. Suresh Shah, who is the Director General of the State-Owned Enterprises Restructuring Unit, Mr. Mahendra Jayasekara, Managing Director of Wall Tiles and Lanka Tiles, Mr. Kumarasiri, Director General of NDP, Mr. Chandrasena Malia, the former Secretary to the Ministry of Plan Implementation, Ministry of Southern and Regional Development, and Ministry of Post and Telecom. So thank you very much and for taking time off your busy schedule to come and attend this session. Please be in touch with us, and we will take this document forward. So let me hand this mic to our consultant, Sohan Fenando, to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lasitha. Without taking much of your time, I would like to now invite Ms. Rehana Thowfeek, Research Associate Advocate, to commence the presentation. Good.
Thank you, and good evening to everybody. So I will be presenting to you the findings of a research paper which was co-authored by Dhananath and myself on state-owned enterprises. So basically the paper is a culmination of many years of research that Advocata has been doing on state-owned enterprises. So before we go any further, I think it's worth investigating or understanding what are the origins of Sri Lanka's SOEs and the different kinds of reform eras that the economy has undergone since independence. So initially, post-independence, Sri Lanka did not have a very robust and productive private sector. So neither was there much foreign investment, and it was necessary for the government of Sri Lanka to get involved in the setup of commercial activities. So driven later on by the ideologies of self-reliance, import substitution, from the 40s to the 70s, we saw the setup of multiple state-owned manufacturing businesses and other businesses in plantations, transport, and finance. With the aim of decolonizing business activity in the country, several industries like the petroleum distribution and plantations were also nationalized in the 1960s, which led to the establishment of very large state monopolies like CPC and the CEB. Along with the growth of SOEs, we also saw public sector employment grow rapidly as well. Between 1970 and 1977, public sector employment grew by 5 times, but its contribution to the economy was not that significant. But these policies were quite popular among the people of Sri Lanka, and with many clamoring for government jobs and subsidized food and utilities. And by the 1970s, the state had failed to create enough job opportunities and economic growth for the youth population, which ultimately led to a youth insurrection. And then it became much easier for the government to keep establishing SOEs and absorbing these young people into state jobs. So despite the rapid expansion of the number of SOEs, which at the time of our research publication of our paper, it was about 527 SOEs as far as we know, and its accompanying expenses, the government's tax revenue did not keep up. In fact, it has reduced over many decades. And even though we had many waves of liberalization and economic reform since 1977, there have been many attempts as well made to break state monopolies and encourage private sector investment, but these have unfortunately not succeeded. And since about the mid-2000s, there was more nationalist policy started dominating economic policy, and as a result, we saw that the privatization or the reduction of state-owned enterprises really did not take on until the crisis in 2021. So as we all know, the Sri Lanka's economic problems stem mainly from its budget deficit issues. And the state-owned enterprises are a fundamental part of this problem. SOE losses have snowballed into 1.8 trillion rupees, and they have accumulated debt of 1.5 trillion, with many of the large SOEs like CPC, Sri Lankan Airlines, and CEB being extremely complicit in this problem. So I will just steal from something that Dhananath has mentioned. I'm not sure whether you have seen it in the papers, but this is about 18 times the amount of payee tax that the government hopes to collect with its latest tax reforms. I mean, that's a huge amount. So that means anybody who's paying payee tax will have to pay for 18 years, basically, to cover these losses. So with larger macroeconomic reforms like debt restructuring and expenditure rationalization, are essential, they will obviously take time to do. So reforming SOEs are an important avenue that the government has to go down, and it will not only reduce fiscal deficits but also help to boost government revenue through asset sales. So out of these, I'll just talk a little bit about the governance landscape of these SOEs. Out of the 527 SOEs, about 287 are monitored by the Department of Public Enterprises, and the rest are by the Department of National Budget. And all of these, both of these departments come under the Finance Ministry. So these 527 SOEs are governed by one of two acts: the Finance Act number 38 of 1971 and the Companies Act number 7 of 2007. The dominant issue with respect to our SOEs is their operational and financial underperformance. And it's not like this issue is unknown either, because if you look at, I have just extracted a quote from the Department of Public Enterprises, which oversees the 287 SOEs, like I mentioned before. This is something that they state in the annual report. They talk about the failures in governance, the policy inconsistency, and the non-commercial way in these, the way in which these SOEs operate. So the root problem with our SOEs are the conflicting objectives which stem from the lack of clearly defined ownership and responsibilities for each stakeholder involved in the running of the SOE. It is a classic principal agent problem where the interests of the principals, in this case the public, differ from the interests of the agents, in this case the government and the SOE managers. Neither the managers nor the politicians have invested any of their money in the SOE. So the performance is not really a primary objective. But they do have other incentives to run the SOE to benefit them personally, which does not always align with the best interests of the citizens, who are the principals in this case. So as a result, SOEs operate in the best interests of the agents, who more often than not dole out public employment opportunities, abuse resources for election purposes, and use SOEs as an outlet for political patronage. And this has resulted in highly undesirable outcomes with respect to its efficiency and profitability. So compounding this operational inefficiency, which stems from the conflict of interests, are the soft budget constraints, which essentially measures the willingness of the government to intervene and bail out loss-making SOEs. So the absence of commitment to fiscal discipline and the degree of willingness of the government to intervene is illustrated in the complete disregard for the fiscal rules which have been set in place by the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, or the FMRA, which clearly sets out a ceiling on the budget deficit and the government borrowing that can be incurred. The government of Sri Lanka regularly circumvents these legislative restraints, and very fortunately for SOEs, they do benefit a lot from this. The FMRA originally set out a limit of 4.5% of GDP on the amount of government guarantees that can be given to SOEs. But this limit has been raised 3 times already since the time that the law was enacted. And in 2021, this limit was raised to 15%, which is almost thrice the original level. The government also routinely provides letters of comfort or treasury guarantees for SOEs. As a result, these chronically loss-making SOEs have accumulated billions in publicly guaranteed debt, which now amount to 1.8 trillion rupees. Additionally, there's also no mandate to publicly disclose annual reports and performance reports. So the people of Sri Lanka, don't even know how badly these SOEs are failing. Thirdly, in order for the government to meet some of its social objectives of providing goods and services at low cost to the public, price controls on essential commodities are a policy that almost all successive governments of Sri Lanka have pursued. SOEs and private competitors are forced to sell these items at controlled prices even if they don't cover production, import, or distribution costs. And these controls have inevitably led to supply shortages and surpluses, which are absorbed by the central government through subsidies or direct allocations, financed largely through debt. So as you can see, these numbers are from the annual reports of the CEB and CPC, and they clearly state that this is the loss. The CEB has faced a loss of 59 billion rupees in 2021, directly attributable to the government's subsidy policy. With regard to energy prices, the price controls also fail to address the core problem which it's trying to address, which is the issue of income inequality. So there was a study that was conducted by the IMF in multiple countries, and in that study they found that in the case of price controls on utilities like fuel and electricity, which are disproportionately consumed by higher income groups, it actually leads to the government subsidy being funneled into higher income groups. People who consume more benefit more from the subsidy. So as a result, these price controls are regressive and ineffective. Finally, the issue of corruption. And I don't think we need to go into detail here, as we are all very much aware of the issues with respect to corruption. But the social costs of SOE misgovernance and corruption are illustrated, I think, currently in the unfolding events with respect to the purchase of medicines which are going into state hospitals. I mean, it perfectly illustrates the conflict of interest. There's a clear case where it's working not in the favor of the general public, but the agents, they benefit from it, and the system is working to benefit them. So in the last year, the banking sector lent 920 billion rupees to SOEs, and the treasury extended support of rupees 75 billion to SOEs. So obviously, it's the right of the people to know how these funds are utilized. So Advocata actually devised a scorecard method to evaluate the financial and governance performance of SOEs. And you can find detailed information in our website, www.soe.lk. But I will just highlight a few key and very aggregate findings here. So out of the 52 strategically important SOEs, which we were able to find published reports of, 13 of these we categorize as total failures in terms of financial performance. And the notable SOEs like the CEB and CPC are in this lot. Other prominent SOEs like Sri Lanka Ports Authority and Milco fall into unsuccessful category. And even large state-owned banks like People's Bank and Bank of Ceylon we categorize as marginally successful. As you can see, some of the very prominent SOEs like CEB and CPC and Sri Lankan Airlines have a return on assets very much in the negative red zone, and these are failing miserably. And then others like the Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank, although marginally successful, generate a return on assets below the average effective interest rate. So very few SOEs perform on par with private local competitors and regional counterparts. And in terms of profitability, which may not always be a sufficient indicator for performance of SOEs, because SOEs also have other social objectives beyond which cannot be evaluated with profitability. The best performing SOEs are the ones in the banking and finance sector. However, despite showing high profits in this period, the ROA on these SOEs is below 1%. And when compared to private banks, generates a return on assets which is about 40 to 50% lesser than private counterparts. So this brings us to the next question of how do we improve the performance of SOEs. Now, SOEs are not a Sri Lankan phenomenon. There are thousands all around the world. So the international best practices for corporate governance of SOEs are well documented. The OECD, for instance, has mapped out 7 guidelines on corporate governance for SOEs, and these are followed by about 38 OECD members as well as 3 partner economies. These guidelines state that the state ought to have a very clear rationale for ownership with clear policies on the state's role in operation and governance of the SOE, as well as very clearly defined roles and responsibilities for each stakeholder involved. The state is expected to act as an informed and active owner while allowing full operational autonomy to the SOE board and managers. The legal, regulatory, and institutional framework within which SOEs operate should ensure a level playing field and fair competition in the market with respect to private competitors. And SOEs should be subject to the same standards of disclosure as public listed companies. So Sri Lankan SOEs fail on almost all of these accounts. As mentioned before, Sri Lanka's SOEs operate as an extension of the political machinery and do not exercise the act of establishing well-structured, merit-based and transparent appointments to SOE boards. There are several well-documented examples of kith and kin, friends and close associates of politicians in power being appointed to top positions in SOEs, despite having no experience or qualifications to merit the appointment. Sri Lanka's SOEs suffer from ill-defined objectives, responsibilities and mandates and are not subject to rigorous governance standards. In addition, many of our SOEs also operate in either monopolistic or duopolistic markets with exclusive rights to sell or distribute a product or service. So they enjoy preferential access to government finance, subsidies, and tax breaks, which give them an unfair advantage over private players. So while decisions are made by the state as the owner of the SOE or the managers of the SOE are not, they are not beyond reproach constitutionally, but in practice there's very little accountability. In terms of transparency and disclosure, as I said before, when we were conducting this study, we struggled to find some of the annual reports of many of the SOEs, and then finally we had to build our scorecard on the 52 SOEs that we could find. So that's 52 out of some 500 odd. Now, unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to reforming SOEs. It requires initially a very thorough and individual assessment at an individual level of these SOEs, and it needs a team of very technically sound people. There also needs to be the legal and institutional frameworks have to be in place or updated to allow some of these reforms to come through. So our recommendations are as follows. Since one of the main structural impediments to Sri Lanka is that the SOEs are operating in monopolistic markets with no competition or consumer choice, we require deep reforms to create the legal pathway for private competitors, as well as to establish and this requires strengthening and establishing competition law in the country. In the immediate term, we recommend that SOEs undergo a process of corporatization to allow them to operate more independently and competitively. All SOEs must be brought under the Companies Act in order for this to happen. This will strengthen the roles and responsibilities of the directors who are charged with overseeing the performance of the company, hold the board members under legal obligation to act in the best interest of the company, and by extension, the general public. Board members must be chosen on a merit-based system, which will evaluate their technical skills, relevancy in the field, competency, and ensure that there are no conflicts of interest. Second, each SOE must produce a statement of corporate intent, which sets out the SOE's mission, vision, goals, objectives, targets, strategic plans, expenditure and financing plans, and financial and non-financial key performance indicators. This will help improve transparency and accountability. The lack of financial discipline is one of the major issues with respect to Sri Lankan SOEs. Therefore, measures must be taken to enforce it in the medium to longer term. SOEs must be subject to very rigorous accounting standards with respect to and disclosure standards. And at the very minimum, these standards need to be in line with at least the companies which are publicly listed. These reports should be submitted in a timely manner and be subject to independent audits. Currently, under the FMRA, there are limits set on the provision of government guarantees for liabilities incurred by SOEs, with the original limit being 4.5%, and which was subsequently raised to 15% of GDP. So these limits need to be reversed in the medium term and returned to the original levels, and the legislation must be strengthened to prevent these periodic revisions. If at all, if revisions are required, these should be done as a special circumstance and only with respect to that particular period, and not an overall increase, which can apply to all subsequent years. With respect to the government stipulated price controls, which have intended but failed to fulfill social and public policy obligations, we propose that these be discarded and the government just adopt a regulatory role instead, allowing market forces to operate to achieve a market price, while at the same time taking measures to improve competition, especially in monopolistic and duopolistic markets. Liberalization involves the opening up of industries or markets which have previously been monopolized by an SOE for private sector players. Liberalization can be an initial step in the privatization process, and some methods which can take longer time to implement. Liberalization also ensures that economies do not intentionally or unintentionally replace state monopolies with private ones. So for liberalization to take place successfully, there are certain structural reforms. For example, any legal barriers that prevent the entry of private players into the market, these need to be obviously addressed and removed. Now, while there were a variety of short and long-term methods to reforming SOEs, given the history of SOEs in the country as well as the financial situation of the country, it's our recommendation that privatization should be considered a priority. Privatization and moving away of government engagement in commercial activity should be a long-term goal for Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has significant cash flow issues, so privatization is also inevitable because the state needs to find ways to improve its financial position. Privatization will bring an infusion of financiers into public coffers, as well as reduce the future drain of public resources, as governments are no longer obligated to financially show up ill-performing SOEs. Getting privatization right, however, is quite important, and the manner in which this is done and sequenced can actually affect its success. It's a complicated process which requires a lot of technical capacity, and privatization requires the coming together of financial, legal, and marketing expertise to deliver a successful privatization drive. It can take place in a variety of ways through asset sales and public lists, such as through asset sales and public listing. Now, previous privatization efforts have been hampered due to a lack of accurate and up-to-date audited financial accounts. So this shortcoming needs to be addressed. It is vital that the state handle the privatization process in an open, competitive, and non-political manner to increase the returns to the state. The privatization of Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation in 2003 and Lanka Marine Services in 2002 was, there was a lot of controversy around it. Because there was evidence that public officials had undervalued the business using bogus evaluation methods, and that buyers had used legal loopholes to conceal the true identity of the beneficiary. So this kind of privatization should be avoided at all cost. Sri Lanka can't adequately address its foreign exchange shortage problems or promise creditors a credible debt restructuring plan without addressing the issues with respect to SOEs. So reforming SOEs are a core part of the country's economic reform plan. And to get Sri Lanka from its current economic trajectory onto a path of more economic, of sustainable and inclusive economic growth, it's very important to consider the privatization of SOEs as well as reforming the entire governance framework. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Rehana Thowfeek. She co-authored the paper along with Dhananath Fenando. Without much ado, I would like to now invite our session chair and panelists to take their seats. I would like to invite Mr. Suresh Shah, Director General, State-Owned Enterprise Restructuring Unit, to take his seat. I would like to invite Dhananath Fenando, CEO of Advocata, to please take his seat. And also Rehana Thowfeek, Research Associate Advocata. The panelist, Mr. Mahendra Jayasekara, Managing Director of Lanka Wall Tiles. Please take your seat, sir. And Mr. R.H.W.A. Kumarasiri, Director General of the National Planning Department. And Ms. Chandrasena Maliad, the former Secretary, Ministry of Planning Implementation, Ministry of Southern Region Development, and Ministry of Post and Telecommunication. Please take your seat, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Just to set the tone and the context for reforms, both state-owned enterprise as well as others, let me just start with a few words. In 1948, 75 or now almost 76 years since at the time we got independence, Sri Lanka was second only to Japan on a number of indicators, including economic. Today, as we all know, there are, this is within the Asian region. Today, as we all know, there are many countries that have gone far ahead of Sri Lanka. And again, I'm talking just within the Asian region. So clearly, on the economic front, although our roofs may no longer be thatched roofs, pollatu roofs, and instead we may have tiles and we may have amano sheets, the reality is that from an economic perspective, we have gone backwards. Why? Because many other countries have gone far ahead of us. As a country, we have also had 2 youth insurrections. And on top of that, we have had a third conflict within the country, as we all know, a 30-year war. So frankly, when you look at Sri Lanka's performance over the last 75 years, we can say that going forward, we need to have a different style and a different way of managing this country than we have done in the past. If we continue to do what we have done in the past, the result will be no different in the future, or if we want a different result, we need to do things differently going forward. So this is the context of the reforms, irrespective of what kind of reforms that we are talking about. And as we all know, I think there are a number of reforms that are being contemplated. Recently we saw reforms to the central bank with a new act that has come in. And the state-owned enterprise reforms, or the SOE reforms, are part and parcel of this broader reform process. Now, the politicians will tell you that these reforms are being done because the IMF wants us to do them. That may be the compulsion at the end of the day, but frankly, we need to do things which are right by us, not just because somebody else tells us to do it. So I don't like to use that phrase, we are doing things because the IMF tells us to do it. Certainly the role that I am playing in the state-owned enterprise restructuring is not because the IMF wants us to do something, but because not just me, but the team that is running the SOE restructuring process today, all of us truly believe that what we are doing will be of benefit to the country, and these are things that need to be done. Now, in terms of the SOE reforms themselves, Rehana in her presentation had highlighted certain recommendations, some of the things that we need to do going forward. And I'm pleased to tell you that very recently we had a policy, a SOE policy that was approved by Cabinet. And that policy document covers, I would think, about 95% of what you have indicated in that single slide on recommendations. The one thing, Rehana, that is not included, or one thing that we have not made mandatory, is the listings. And there is a rationale for that as well. We have the opportunity to bring in strategic investors into some of these enterprises, people who know and understand that particular business, and not all of them may want the companies listed. So wherever we can, we will ask them to list the companies. We will say that's our preference, but we may not be able to list everything. So that I think is one deviation from your recommendations, but I quickly looked at what you had suggested. I think practically everything else is there. And I'm also very pleased to tell you that we have recommended, you were speaking about board appointments, and I'm very pleased to tell you that we have recommended a mechanism to appoint directors to boards of state-owned enterprises, which will build a Chinese wall between the politicians and between the appointments. Mr. Fenando, who is in the audience at the back, Mr. Ranjit Fenando, was helpful together from the Ceylon Chamber in helping us come up with some part of this mechanism. So that's also in place. So hopefully things might improve going forward. But before I get into any more detail, let me start with the panelists and give them. You have 10 to 15 minutes each. So let's try and keep time also, because I think it's getting late also. So Dhananath, let me start with you from in the corner. State-owned enterprises, what are your thoughts on the reforms and the things that we need to do?
I will speak about the policy lens that we have been considering with a short story, and I'll hand it over to the senior panelist here. There was this story in India, this is a true story, called the cobra effect. There was this one particular type of cobras which were causing a lot of human deaths. This was before 1947, when the British were ruling India. And this became a massive problem for the Indian government because people are suffering from cobra deaths. And they came up with a solution, and the solution was they promoted an incentive package. Basically, if the people brings a dead cobra and hand it over to the government office, they will get a financial incentive. Makes sense, because then it distributes the cobra capturing mechanism. People kill the cobras, handing it over to the government office, they get a financial incentive. Looks sensible. 2-3 months, system worked perfectly. After 3 months, the British government realized there's something wrong, because there were so many cobras handing over to the government office and they are just dispersing money. Then when they investigate, they realize Indians have become a little bit entrepreneurial, because they realize that if you are handing over a dead cobra, that's one way of earning a good income. So they had breeding houses inside the house to breed cobras, and so they killed 4 or 5 cobras and giving it to the government office to earn money. Now remember, this policy of incentive brought to reduce the population of cobras. And then the British government realized, okay, this is not going to work. We are going to announce that this policy is no longer in effect from this particular date. And as soon as they announced that, of course, people realized there is no incentive to, keep these cobras which have already been breeded inside the houses. They release all the cobras to the jungle, so which basically doubled or tripled the population of cobras than it was initially. Now, the policy lens that we have to look at is, in the business world, we know we all want the market share, and there are a lot of senior businessmen. I'm not going to, we are competing, we are taking the market share. Now, the policies that we have looked at, in the public policy, the winners and losers both are becoming your problem. Because when you are implementing a policy, now as the British government case, when people are dying from cobra bites, that becomes their problem on one side. And again, when they introduce an incentive, when people are basically breeding and handing over the cobras, that also becomes their problem. And when they stop it, when the cobra population further increases, it again becomes their problem. So in public policy, this has to look at a very different lens, because even on the SOE reforms, of course, there are consequences, and different people look at this problem on different angles. Some looking at the sovereignty angle, some looking at the profitability angle. But what we have looked at is basically on the market basis, because when the markets are allowed to work, and we are in the view that the government has no business in business. Because the more you do it, the more that you complicate it. Of course, there are arguments, there are certain sectors that the private sector doesn't want to engage. And in that front, there may be exceptions, and that's why I think in our research paper, it's not like a one-size-fits-for-all solution. There has to be multiple approaches. So that's the overall on my comments, but I think in terms of the SOE reforms, it's important that we do it faster and transparently. And I know a lot is on the shoulders of Suresh, because there's an Overton window. There's an opening that we can get this done. And the worst thing to waste is a crisis, because now people are open for these reforms to an extent. People aware what was the causes of government running the business. I'm sure everyone recalls, if the government was so good at running the businesses, why people ran out of petrol, why people had 12-hour power cuts. So, of course, this system doesn't work. And we have brought a very data-driven scientific method why it doesn't work. And why only the profitability is not the only measure, because it has to be the return on assets, because there are multiple arguments. Okay, some state-owned enterprises are making profits, why you need to privatize? It's like me coming and saying, I am running a business, I earn 100 rupee profit. It doesn't make any sense, because my asset base is 100,000. For 100,000, I make 100 rupee profit. While Rehana comes and says, okay, I earn a 50 rupee profit, but my asset base is 1,000 rupees. Of course, Rehana's business is more profitable than I do, because I am using 100,000 value of the resources from the economy to make 100 rupee profit. But instead, Rehana uses only 1,000 rupees or 1,000 value from the economy to make a 50 rupee profit. So, of course, she runs the business more effectively rather than I do. Of course, I can brag about that I'm making a profit. So, this profitability is not the only indicator. Of course, it is one indicator, but it is the return on assets. That's the overall that's why I said we have to look at on a different lens. It's not only the profitability or whether we are making a profit. And most of the state-owned enterprises who have made profits, which is good, but they make 100 million profit this year and then make about 5 billion losses next year. So it doesn't making a profit this year, and based on the environment, things change. So I hope, what I can all say is, I think as think tanks, we have brought this conversation, we have brought a scientific method to it, and we have articulated what needs to be done. This is research work since we started as Advocata in 2016. And we were not the only one who have been saying it. There are a lot of senior businessmen. I'm sure they know a lot of practical examples, how difficult to manage, what's the political interference that is coming in. So I think it's time that we get these reforms now. Otherwise, it's like now or never instance. So I will stop from there. But I think it's a must that we do it. Otherwise, we will again slip back to where we were in 2022 with a massive economic crisis.
Thank you, Dhananath. Rehana, I won't ask you to speak because you made a presentation already, but I just want you to remind us on a few numbers because Dhananath spoke about some of the numbers, the profits and the losses. In your presentation, you covered how much the SOE sector had borrowed and what their total profits or losses were. Can you just remind us of the borrowing number and the loss number?
Yes, so the accumulated debt is in 1.8 trillion rupees and the accumulated losses are 1.5 billion.
Okay.
Trillion, sorry.
And last year's SOE borrowing was?
Last year's,
900
I can't
million.
recall.
Was that the number?
From the banking sector.
From the banking.
920 billion rupees.
Right.
Yes.
So I just want to just make a point here. On 920 million borrowing, if you take a return.
Billion,
right?
Billion.
Yeah. So on 920 billion, had the private sector borrowed this amount, 920 billion, Mahendra, you're the private sector person here, right? But let's assume you had a 10% return. So that's 90 billion, okay? And at a corporate tax of 30%, that would give you another 30 billion to government, right? So if this money had been in the private sector, and I think the number would have been more than this, I'm just taking a very low 10% figure, right? The government would have actually got about 30 billion in taxes had this borrowing gone to the private sector rather than to the SOEs. So that's just for information purposes. Mahendra, private sector, but you're running a company that was at one time a state-owned enterprise. You saw Rehana's presentation, the recommendation she has made, the other things that were in it, the historical information that was in it. Where your lens of running a business that was once a government entity, today a private sector entity, talk us through your experiences in this whole process. What are the pros and cons that you saw with the enterprise being in government, now in private sector? And how do you respond from that perspective? How do you respond to Rehana's presentation?
Yes, Suresh. Now, okay, I am running a privatized enterprise, Lanka Ceramic PLC. Now, actually, this happened nearly 30 years ago, the privatization, and it was, now Rehana also said that some of these companies should be listed, but now Lanka Ceramic is an example of an organization or a corporation that was sold through the stock exchange, and of course, unsuspecting investor bought into it, and he got into a major mess. And that is because actually, I'm just, revisiting the past. It may not be relevant today under your chairmanship of restructuring state-owned enterprises. Now, when Lanka Ceramic was privatized through the stock exchange, what happened was basically the government hadn't done enough work to make sure that the assets listed in the offer for sale document were duly with the entity. And in that, what happened was when we went in, we realized lots of freehold properties, immovable freehold properties listed in the offer for sale document or the prospectus were not really with us, and legally, because no vesting orders were there, no gazette notifications were there, no deeds were there. So basically, we had lot of problems in holding on to the properties. As we speak, also I have a case with the Land Reform Commission where they are trying to acquire a 20-acre property that had been with us and which is listed as a freehold property in the prospectus. So there are lots of issues like that. So when we try to, as a, investor goes and buys it, and when he tries to manage the business, but there are a whole lot of other issues that we have to deal with. And also, what happens is, now, actually our structure is, I have spoken about this before, because even though the corporation or the SOE has been privatized, the politicians think that they still own these places really. And they still try to interfere with the management, try to interfere with the management through the unions and make companies' life difficult. And policy inconsistency also creeps in there because government at the top level, they think we no longer are responsible for these institutions and we can do whatever we want with the policy. That is exactly what happened to Lanka Ceramic also. After privatization, they removed the protection they gave for tableware in the country, and the company is gone. And it's the same thing that happened to textile industry. Tulliriya Textiles, Veyangura Textiles, all these textile companies or corporations that were privatized. Subsequently, the government overnight removed the protection and the companies were just closed. So from that point of view, I would think when we try to restructure SOEs, one thing you will see from the local market perspective is, because whatever said and done locally, now we also speak to a lot of people through other associations I am involved in. Now, what happens is locally people tend to think that these corporations need not be privatized, right? At the lower level, people think, because in Colombo, yes, people think, no, these have to be privatized. But others think they need not be privatized. That is because, to a certain extent, politicians who talk in favor of privatization in parliament go and tell their villagers, these things don't need to be privatized. That is also one thing. Recently also, one person told me that a minister in the government had gone and told a Buddhist monk, very prominent Buddhist monk, Sri Lankan Airlines need not be privatized because they can get a person to come and work free and run Sri Lankan Airlines and make it profitable. But now our people are sometimes gullible because they don't have commercial experience, commercial exposure, and they think, yes, it can be done, because actually there is duality in terms of the attitude and the opinions they express publicly. Sometimes these politicians, although they go and say, look, these need to be privatized, reform, they don't need things to be privatized because they lose power. So that is one aspect you have to consider in doing all this. And the other thing is, not many people understand the importance of return on assets or return on equity. How much these state-owned enterprises are bringing in as returns, and the amount of taxation the government can get out of privatization. Because the thing is, actually people think, now, see, look at countries like Nigeria, Suresh. Now, they have lots of natural resources, but the country is in a major mess. Actually, here the problem to me is not the SOE reforms first. First, the reforms of governance. Actually, it's not a problem it's not an economic problem. We have a governance problem in this country. Unless and until you fix this governance issue, however much you try to reform SOEs, people will not trust this. Because you try to sell SOEs and you collect the money and you are making this money available for embezzlement. That is what is happening in the country, and that is why people don't actively support this. Of course, now this has become a compulsion. Without this, we can't breathe. So that is the story we are trying to tell. Yes, sell. So that is what is happening. But in effect, what people are thinking is that, these are poorly managed. That is obvious, right? And these corporations have been purposefully run down for political gains. And these need not be privatized. These can be properly managed. That is what people think. And people think once you privatize these SOEs, the money available for embezzlement in the government is more. So this will be embezzled. So that is a key issue from a public perspective. We have to manage when it comes to state-owned enterprises. So it's a difficult task, but of course, all of us agree that it has to be done. But the problem is how it can be done, how fast we can do it, and what benefits will accrue to the public, general public of this country are actually unknown. So I would think first the governance has to be fixed, and thereafter everything will flow, people will support. Because why I feel that still the politicians are not willing to fix this governance issue is, the most recent example is online safety bill. Now, in that bill, President appoints the commission, he removes the commission. So if there is any idea of improving governance, that provision need not have been put. So that is why people are very skeptical about this approach, really. About this approach. But I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Mahendra. You may have to do more than wishing me. Mr. Maliyadda, if I was to come to you, you've been a secretary to the Ministry of Plan Implementation, Ministry of Southern Regional Development, and also Post and Telecommunications. So you've had a very illustrious career in the public service, and you must have seen the different attempts made on privatizations in the past. Can you share some of those experiences, plus also respond to the presentation that Rehana made?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I must thank these two young, energetic presenters. I may be an old, outdated man to respond to them. But with my experience, I would like to contribute a bit. Now, there are, I think, three basic proposals. One is that the recent experiences of the public due to the inefficiencies of SOEs like the CPs in fuel distribution have increased public opinion on the need for SOE reforms. You have said that in the paper. And say the positive public opinion must be capitalized on to push through SOE reforms before time runs out. I really do not know whether we should work on emotions, which is a sentimental thing, subjective thing. I think this privatization, as your very paper proposed, has to be done in after a very thorough study on each and every SOE. It should not be a policy decision, this or the other, but you have to study each and every organization and then take a decision. So I am rather sort of would like to distance from this statement, because you should not do a firefighting job with the SOE privatization, because privatization is not new to this country. There have been several organizations, as he said, privatized, and some were withdrawn, some went on, some disappeared. Now, for instance, initially how the privatization done was, you call for financial proposal, highest bidder get it. But we really do not know the capacity of that bidder to run the organization. Now, this is what happened to the Kantale sugar factory. This is what happened to the textile factory. Then this is what happened to today see the public transport system, which is privatized. It has become worse. It has become a nightmare. And then the estates were privatized, but the production and the productivity has been gradually coming down. And everyone is complaining. Coconut production has come down, tea production has come down, rubber production has come down. Even the productivity also has declined. Then there are organizations like there was one organization I would like to share, that it was privatized because the government cannot go on with it. But I was serving as a member of this project approving board under the agriculture modernization project. They used to provide grants, and this particular company came for a government grant. So other members kept silent, but I opposed. I said that this company bought this because the government cannot invest on this any longer. So therefore, now they are coming through another back door to get government assistance to run the privatized company. So I vehemently opposed. Then, in fact, the minister said, Maliyadda, I appointed you to this board. I thought that, you would support this. I said, I cannot support. You inquire from the treasury. Then the treasury said, no, you cannot do that. Because once you privatize, they cannot run it and they come back to the government for assistance. This is not the only instance. There are other instances. So we have to be very careful of these instances, how the privatization, more than as a policy, the implementation, especially in this country. And the other thing is, now you have said that why the SOEs came into being. Because there was no private sector operating the commercial ventures. Even today it is so. Where is the private sector? Country was liberalized 40 years ago, but there is no private sector. Private sector is expected to be the engine of growth, but the engine of growth is, I don't see it. This is where the government is getting involved in it. And the government has a political mandate political requirement, they cannot say no, they get involved. It may be bad, but it is the reality. So we have to look at this reality, rather than the justifications and all that, we have to look at the reality. So this is one thing I would like to suggest. Then other one is that you say that SOEs are a core part of the economic reforms plan to get Sri Lanka out of its current economic trajectory and onto path of economic growth. Now this is another misconception in my opinion, because we are looking at the tip of the iceberg. The government budget deficit, the current account problem. But the issue is not that, they are the symptoms of the problem. Issue is that our economy has been gradually eroding, and now at the time of independence we had a flourishing model economy, export-oriented economy. But today, it's import-oriented. After liberalization, we expected export to rise, but imports rise. So this is the true story of the country. So in that, and that we cannot think of only about the government budget deficit and the balance of, because we don't produce. There is no private sector. There are no entrepreneurs. We have only the business people. They are not the private sector. It does not mean, with all due respect, there are some exceptions, but all the others are family businesses, or they are not investing. They don't take a risk. They are doing buying and selling trade, or they are resorting to other things. So we are talking of handing over the ownership of these corrupt, inefficient organizations to another corrupt lot. Now there is a report done by this Washington DC based Global Financial Integrity. It says importers and exporters intentionally falsify the declared value of goods on invoices filed with Sri Lanka Customs to make an average of 4 billion evaporate every year. So this is the private sector. So this is the private sector we talk of. So we have to be very careful, as a policy issue, if we say, yes, privatize, but we have to look at how we are going to do it, which organization is going to be taken up. These things have to be very carefully studied, rather than making a blanket statement, okay, these corrupt organizations, they are overstaffed, there is corruption, they are inefficient, they are not delivering, therefore we must privatize. I think that should not be the principle. We have to study, as you have said in your paper, and in 2021 Central Bank report has said that in a box, that we have to study each and every organization, because they are not equal. They are different. Management style is different, their aim is different, objectives are different, financial strength are different. Therefore, we have to study each and every organization separately, and then take a decision as to how we are going to restructure them, reform them. The privatization should not be a panacea. There may be instances where we can do that, but there may be instances we should not do it. Therefore, we have to be very careful. This is my experience in the public service, and I may be too bureaucratic, but my experience is that. But if you take the politicians is corrupt, public sector is corrupt, private sector is corrupt, banks are corrupt, so then we are talking of handing over the ownership from one corrupt sector to another corrupt sector. So we have to be very careful. It has to be a very studied program, and it has to be a very transparent program, and then it should be it has to be very informative program based on facts and figures.
Thank you, Mr. Maliyatha. Now we have a big problem here, because no sector in the country is capable not just of running the SOEs, but even of other businesses. But
sorry, this is not what I said. This is what the IMF report.
No. I'm not saying it's what you said. I'm just pointing out the reality here. No, but this goes back to really what Mahendra first spoke of about governance, that without governance, the country cannot progress and move forward. And we speak about the IMF program, and we feel that the IMF program is going to deliver us from bankruptcy. but we need to also understand that this is the 17th time that we have gone to the IMF. Now, I see we have two bankers, active bankers in the room, one retired banker as well. Now, generally, if the private sector goes to a bank the first time, the bank will, yes, of course, they will look at your case. They will say, okay, fine, you have a business case, etc., etc., and they might lend you money the first time. You go back after a few years, again having fallen into trouble, and the bank, okay, they might look at you positively again, but to a lesser degree than the first time, and they might extend some facility to you. Now, if you also, in a very short period of time, go back the third time, again having fallen into trouble, the bank is not going to let you through the front door. But if you take the IMF, we have been to the IMF 16 times before the 17th time, right? And what does that tell you? Now, it doesn't say anything wrong about the IMF, but it certainly tells you that there is a problem in the way this country has been governed. So I'll leave a thought with you before I move on to Mr. Kumarasiri. How is it that the 17th time is any different to the previous 16 times? And unless it is different, right, unless the 17th time is different to the previous 16 times, the result is going to be no different. We'll be back with the IMF for the 18th program also in about 4.5 years from today, because in 75 years we have gone 17 times, so average is about 4.5 years between visits to the IMF. Right? So I'll leave that thought with you. Mr. Kumarasiri, you're Director General of the National Planning Department. You see firsthand, you have firsthand experience in how these SOEs function. What are your thoughts around the subject in terms of state-owned enterprise restructuring, how these enterprises are managed? What are your thoughts in terms of what needs to be done?
Yeah, I think I agree with both Mr. Maliad's view as well as the presenters, their views as well. Just to add to you, the 17th time is different, definitely, than the previous 16. Now, country situation is different. And SOEs are functioning, as Mr. Maliad mentioned, as well as the report also mentioned. It's different implementation when it comes to the different SOEs. And all what they have mentioned, it is almost correct. The appointing into the SOEs by the respective minister or ministry or based on the act, we don't have a much mechanism to identify the suitable people. As you just mentioned, now you are in the process of making correction or making some good initiative to at least identify suitable people. Not only SOEs, for my view, even within the government system, do we have a real mechanism to identify the suitable people in the right place in the government system rather than SOEs? I don't see it. There should be a mechanism, at least higher level official. How do we going to appoint suitable expertise, experience, personnel into the right place? I'm of course from the government, but I feel it's really bad. Really sorry for that. But we have to appoint someone who to run the place. But it's similar into the SOEs as well. But not only we are talking about SOE, rather than SOE, even entire government system. We have to look at it overall, how this country is running. Entire government system, what I feel as a DG National Planning, we are not doing what we require to do. And performance are very low. And are we really implementing our planned projects? Even we are funding. I'm having many meetings, one after the other, to at least expedite the process. Even within the government system, within the ministry, are we looking at all the loan or the grant projects to run the country? I don't see it much. But some places are maybe they are performing well. Most of the cases are not similar, not doing well. And SOEs are the same. Why SOE we are differentiating? That is because of the SOEs, they are expecting business, but government can do the business properly. As in the past, as we know, governance is one of the main reason to be established in this country. Not only SOE, for everything. Governance must. I think paper not very much highlighted governance issue is the must, but as other speakers mentioned, governance is must in this country, not only for private, not only for SOEs, not only for government sector, everywhere. We have to have a governance that is must, and government should emphasize. But are we really take this opportunity? Economic crisis, this is not only SOEs, of course, entire country, but SO, now we are looking at the SOEs. Are we really engaged? You are head of reform unit, but are we getting everyone into the one agenda? The unions are going one direction, and political parties are going different directions, and public are going somewhere else. How we are take everyone into the one direction to overcome this economic crisis in this Sri Lanka? We have to educate, we have to communicate, we have to aware the public and everyone. This is the situation, and we have to take them into the board. And trust should be built among the agencies, and tell them, tell truth, what we should do in Sri Lanka. And I'm not word the privatization, but restructuring is must, SOEs. Therefore, we have to tell the truth to the public, because we only hear Colombo-based people, academics, and researchers, and maybe public sector. We are talking about restructuring SOEs. Do you know these villages, they have any idea about what is happening in Sri Lanka? No. I think I can fully understand the politician. They are talking with you maybe one word, and talking with others is different word. How can we go ahead with this situation? We have to have a common understanding, and also need consensus among all the parties to come one platform to overcome these issues and challenges. Otherwise, we will go back to again another crisis very soon, because we have to keep all our agenda behind. But this is the agenda for country. Then therefore we have to look at positively and see our country where we are going and heading, and somebody has to do it. The media, academia, researchers, civil society, public sector, private sector, all has to come one platform and do it. Otherwise, we will see maybe very soon going back to again same situation. That is worst scenario. But I agree with Mr. Malia also, and I have noted, we have to have a different model. Malia also, and I have noted, we have to have a different model for different SOEs. We cannot fix I think paper also highlighted, and make it plan. Action plan, time-bound action plan. Give someone to look at it. You can't do all under your head, but we have to have a mechanism to at least analyze. We don't have an expert in Sri Lanka much. We have to get outsiders to look at the issues, challenges faced by each and every SOEs, and then make a plan and identify what we should do each and every. I know we can start with the bigger ones and the loss-making ones first, and then make it happen. And this opportunity should not miss. I also agree with that. And this is the opportunity. People are thinking government will do something. And we had faced difficult year last year, and at least to overcome those issues maybe coming years. Therefore, I think we have to do a lot of activities and under your head, and of course finance and central bank, all other government entities, and also the president might look at. There are a lot of action being taken so far, but that has to be continued. We have to address the governance issue, and others can maybe sort it out.
Thank you, Mr. Kumarasiri. Rehana, I would like you to respond to the comments made by the 4 other panelists. But before you get on to your responses, again, just for your information of the audience, let me just paint a picture in terms of how the operations of the state-owned enterprises how it creates a vicious cycle. So, like all of us are aware, until very recently, every one of us enjoyed subsidized fuel through the CPC. The subsidy was not taken into government's books, but instead it was parked. The subsidy was parked with the entity, with the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. Rehana showed you the numbers. I think there was a massive loss of
45 billion.
45 billion, right. Now, what did the CPC do in order to recover at least a part of this loss? They charged a super premium on jet fuel on every single airline that flew in and out of Sri Lanka. When I say super premium, the price was much higher than compared to the rest of the Asian region. And they did this so that they could reduce some of the losses by parking those subsidies, the subsidies that all of us got. Now, Sri Lankan Airlines, about 30% of their operating expenditure is jet fuel. So when CPC started charging these very heavy, very high prices, the losses at Sri Lankan Airlines also went up. So they even went to the extent of doing some I mean, which sounds silly, but from their perspective, it made sense. So if they, for example, if they knew a plane that was coming, say, out of Chennai was coming to Colombo and then flying to Singapore, they loaded the plane with sufficient fuel to come from Chennai and then go to Singapore, because the price in Colombo was too high. They had this way of calculating this, right? So in other words, they were carrying more fuel than they needed on the Chennai-Colombo sector, as a result of which the plane was heavier and then the consumption of fuel was even higher, right? So all these went on to increase the loss of Sri Lankan Airlines. Now, when Sri Lankan Airlines and CPC make losses, no private sector bank will lend to them. The government was also not willing to pump money in because the government didn't have the money. What did they do? They went to the two state banks, People's Bank and Bank of Ceylon, with treasury guarantees, right, and compel the state banks to extend facilities to these two loss-making enterprises. Now, two things happened. One is, as we know, thanks to the financial crisis, those treasury guarantees are not worth the paper they are written on, number one. Number two, I don't think these entities paid back the state banks, correct? So the state bank balance sheets are also under pressure. So now see what has happened. The entire system, how the vicious cycle has worked. Subsidies parked at the CPC and they make significant losses. Sri Lankan Airlines, because the fuel cost is making much higher losses than they otherwise should have. And the two state bank balance sheets are also under pressure because they are not getting repaid, right? So you see how the entire system has got convoluted because of the start point. And what is the start point? The subsidy was parked in a commercial enterprise. So one of the key reforms, and this is one of the key reforms that we have recommended, and it has been again accepted by Cabinet, is that these subsidies should not be parked within an enterprise, but instead it should be taken into government expenditure. So commercial enterprises need to be run on commercial principles. Yes, government has every right to, they have the power to give a subsidy if they want to, but then let that subsidy go into the government's expenditure account rather than to the account of a commercial enterprise. So again, some food for thought. Rehana, over to you in terms of comments, in terms of your response to the comments that were made by the other panelists.
Yes, with respect to the issue, with respect to what was the view that was raised about the private sector not being in a position to take over some of the SOEs and begin the operations, I think firstly the private sector we have today is a lot different to the private sector we had 30 years ago. If we look at from the garment sector, we are producing high quality garments which are being purchased by massive corporations around the world. And even if you look locally, if you look, say, Satos, Cargill's, Kiehl's, Arpico, the private sector players are dominating the retail, the supermarket industry. So we can't say that, okay, they are not, the private sector is not up for the challenge. Obviously, there are also lots of policy issues that need to be addressed. For example, because because subsequent governments have, created, made our economy into a highly protectionist state. We haven't been able to really, the private sector hasn't been able to pick up as much as it should have, because a lot of the resources are being allocated into protected industries. And then finally, because I think the government is probably wasting its time trying to run business, it's not able to adequately create the policy environment and really drive the reforms that are needed for the private sector to take off. One example, not one example, several examples I can think of: education reform, labor market reform. All of these have just been parked in the back end, nobody is even talking about it. We have an IT sector, and if you go and talk to any private sector, any IT private sector operator, they'll tell you that we have a lot of opportunity, but we don't have enough talent. And why do we not have enough talent? Because we have failed to, the government has failed to undertake the necessary education reforms. If you go to a country, like Australia, and you look at the kind of facilities those children get in schools versus the facilities that our children are getting, it's very different. So unless the government starts focusing on these policy issues and start addressing and really start driving education reform, labor market reform. If you take female labor force participation, I think now it's less than 30% in the most recent labor force service. It's reducing. So why is that? We need to start, the government needs to focus its efforts on policy and not in running business.
Thank you, Rehana. And if I might just, I'll come to you, Ruan, in a moment, but just to add on to what Rehana was saying, there is also two other aspects that I would like to put on the table in a sense. One is, imagine, all of us know cricket. The World Cup is being played right now, although we are not performing as well as we would like to. Having said all of that, imagine if Sri Lanka had to play versus the umpires team, and you had two umpires who were also umpiring the game. Could you believe would you have confidence in the decisions that were given by those umpires? Because because at the end of the day, the people who are the two umpires on either side are also part of the opposition, right? Would you have confidence in the decisions that were given? Now, the reason why I'm asking this is because fundamentally, role of government is to be an umpire. The role of government is to regulate. Government has a responsibility to regulate. Right? There is nobody else who can regulate. Now, when the government is running state-owned enterprises, it's like the umpires are also fielding a team to play in the World Cup games. Because the regulator is also an active market player and competing against the other private sector sources. Right? So it's not a level playing field when the private sector needs to compete versus the government sector. So this is one of the fundamental reasons for not having government involved in business. Right? There is a second very important reason, and this is rupees and cents. Now, all of us know that there are many schools, particularly schools outside Colombo, that don't have roofs over the classrooms. There are no proper classrooms, right? We know some of these schools. Rehana was talking about education and education policy and our young talent requiring that education. We know that there are schools, even some of the Colombo schools don't have proper facilities like laboratories, for instance, right? Now, there aren't too many people, or for example, if you take an underprivileged person who needs to have a heart operation done in a national hospital, right? Somebody, say, from one of the outstations, they would probably have a 6 to 7 month waiting list before they can get their operation done. Why? Because there are no proper operating theaters, there are not enough facilities, no hospital beds, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing is, there aren't too many people who are willing to invest in these kinds of things. There aren't too many people who are willing to go and build roofs in schools or provide laboratory facilities for, many schools in the country. Occasionally a private sector firm might do something as a CSR project and publish in the papers, but there the intention is more about publishing in the papers than doing something really big. So there aren't too many people who are willing to come and put money, put capital into these kinds of public service obligations. On the other hand, there are many people who are willing to come and invest in commercial businesses. So there are plenty of people who might be willing to invest in Sri Lanka telecommunications, in telecom. There may be plenty of people who are willing to invest in the banking sector, plenty of people willing to invest in the insurance business, into hotels and so on and so forth, because they provide a return. Now my question to you is very simple. When there are plenty of people, plenty of investors who are willing to put capital into these commercial businesses, why should government use part of its limited resource base to invest in these commercial businesses rather than investing in the essentials like the hospital sector, like the education sector, and so on and so forth? Now, if the government had all the money in the world, and if our education system, if our education infrastructure, if our health infrastructure, if our road network, and if all of these things were, really world class, and then the government had extra cash, then it's a different ball game. But here we are talking about a government with very limited resources and these public service obligations not being properly fulfilled, right? But nevertheless, government, rather than focusing on those areas, are wanting to go and invest in things like airlines, in terms of telecoms and insurance businesses and so on. Now, I think Mr. Maliada, you were speaking about, or I think was it you, getting different stakeholders on the same page. So with that in mind, last week I was speaking to some young people. When I say young, well, compared to me, so in the 25 to 40 age group category, and this was a Colombo-based group, right? So I asked them how many of them had actually flown on Sri Lankan Airlines. Not even 10% of the people in the room had flown on Sri Lankan Airlines. Yet, the government has put all our money into Sri Lankan Airlines. And why do I say all our money? Because when any one of us buys, say, a packet of biscuits, for example, we are paying a tax. We are paying a 15% tax on a VAT, right? Plus, I think, a 2.5% social service security levy or something like this. And a part of that goes into Sri Lankan Airlines in one way or the other. So all of us are paying for Sri Lankan Airlines, but less than 10%. I don't think 10% of our population has actually flown on Sri Lankan Airlines. So is our money going to the right place? So again, some food for thought for all of you. So Ruan, yes, you put your hand up. And please direct your question to one of the panelists if you don't mind. So that. Sorry, Mr. Fenando.
I want to, we got some very good information from listening to all of you. It's very useful. But also looking at the audience, a distinguished audience, I guess there's a lot of people who can make a good contribution to the thinking process here. So I want to tell you what we are trying to do first. You see, what we are trying to do at the Gamini Korea Foundation. We have set up what is called the Innovators Forum, Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, and started working on 20 odd papers, which are called issues papers, identifying the problems like what we did today. We identified a very important problem with regard to SOE. Now, the main idea behind the Innovators Forum was to identify the problems and also engage the diaspora in a conversation with us. We can learn a lot from the diaspora. You see, we are not unique in facing these type of problems. Other countries also have. But they have been able to overcome many of them. How? What was the approach? See, so that is the reason why we started this. Now, I want to also ask you, see, Mr. Kumarasiri and Mr. Maliad and all that told me, I suffer from one problem. I always look at the problems holistically. I call it the holistic approach to development. You can't treat these problems piecemeal here and there. We identified a lot of problems, but what is the consolidated effort of the government? I was going to ask Mr. Kumaraswamy, have you all started the ball rolling on that? You see, there must be an approach where you bring all these elements together and then have a consolidated approach. And that has to be incorporated into the planning process. I don't want to take your time because, as I said, my intention is to give you some direction to make a good contribution, because I can see a lot of very important people. I don't want to name names, but I look forward to their participation.
Thank you. So since all of you have had opportunity to listen to the panelists, we'll take questions from the floor now. So Ruan, yes, you wanted to ask the first question.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether you would allow only questions. Am I allowed to?
Very short comments.
No, it's okay. No, this is okay. Thank you, first of all, for the comments. I have few questions and comments. My task is made easier by Mr. Maliadda by giving a very, very good analysis of the problem of going blanketly saying that privatization and liberalization is a solution. Let me ask a question. You said the total debt burden of the state-owned enterprises is 1.8 trillion Sri Lankan rupees. Am I right? Okay. What does that mean? 1,800 billion Sri Lankan rupees. Divide by 300, which is 1,800 divided by 300 is how much? 6 billion US dollars. What is the Sri Lanka's total foreign debt?
About 46 billion.
Nearly 60 billion now. So out of 60 billion, here you are talking about a debt of 6 billion out of SOEs. So you think that SOEs has crashed the Sri Lankan economy? I mean, that's a misnomer to start with. So who has created the remaining 54 billion US dollars? Is it the state sector? Or are you going to conclude that it's private sector which has created that 54 billion? Please answer. Number one. Number two, I agree fully with Mr. Maliadda. There is an urgent need for restructuring and reforms of the state sector, but that has to be on a professional basis. That cannot be just to say that we want to open the whole thing for a market. Now, are we living in a market? Or are we living as citizens of a country? Are we going to sacrifice our country's sovereignty just to make ourselves in a market? So isn't the sovereignty, though you said that sovereignty is unimportant, isn't the sovereignty of a country, of its decision-making power, of its people's interest, not as a variable in the equation? Where is the variable sovereignty in your equation? We all have sworn in saying that we all uphold the sovereignty of Sri Lanka. Okay, open up the SOEs, issue shares. And tomorrow the ports, airports, the roads, the waterways and everything will be owned by foreigners. Now, is that what you want? Would not that matter to you? For me, it matters. Sorry, Shah, I don't mind, sorry, Suresh, I don't mind living in a coconut roofed house, if it is my house, rather than living in a pond house owned by someone else in super luxury. That's because I am Sri Lankan. I want Sri Lankan interest to be protected first. Within that, yes, I agree. There are issues. We have done research in Sri Lanka, in University of Colombo. There are issues plaguing the state sector, SOEs. The reforms are necessary. We are all there. But don't take just liberalization and opening up for the market and competition and all as the panacea for all. You gave a nice example of cobras. What happened? Which sector created more cobras? Is that the incentive of the government or the private sector which took it and created cobras? Now, if the government said, okay, we created an SOE to kill cobras in the country, what would have happened? Okay, there would have been some inefficiency. So there will be a director general of killing cobras, true. But then there would not have been this using the killing cobras as a business in the market. I will close with one remark. I was talking to a senior banker in this country, who was my boss also some time ago. He had a son, 5-year-old. The man was saying that I have grey hair. Son, please cut my hair. For each piece of grey hair that you cut, you will get 25 cents. So the father was reading the newspaper, holding the hand, and the son was cutting grey hair and putting on the hand. After a while, the father was looking at, oh my goodness, do I have this much of grey hair in my... What has happened? The son has cut one hair into 4 pieces and has earned 4 times the 25 cents. So be careful. Don't think that panacea for all is the private sector. Let me disagree with Suresh. Private sector and the state sector are not in competition just as in the cricket match. And don't think that umpire is the government. Here, private sector is also Sri Lankan. Government sector is also Sri Lankan. The two parties are not to kill each other. Just like in the cricket match, it is the opposite. Where one party is to defeat the other and not to have a win together. So, analogy is not really correct because we all have to get up. And we need reforms. We need solutions. There are examples from the world, and we have also identified lack of accountability, lack of managerial expertise, lack of proper platform for transparent preferences given, other than just ad hoc ones. There are ways of doing it. So please focus on those. Just trying to say that this is the time, don't miss it, and go and do this. If the house is in fire, that may be a good opportunity for you to see what are the faults in the electricity system of the house and put it in right. But that should not be used as to rob the Almira and rob the family silver. Thank you.
So I guess you want Rehana and Dhananath to respond to you.
The first question only, that is the remaining part is my opinion. That is about the $6 billion versus $60 billion, the debt.
I just want to respond on one other point that you made, Ruan, in terms of the sovereignty. When our debt component is about 120% of GDP, I think the number is 128. When our debt is 128% of our GDP, and when 50% of that debt is owned by foreign nationals in one form or the other, and when we have to take instructions from institutions like the IMF, and when we have to go borrow small sums like $400 million from countries that were born 23 years after Sri Lanka got its independence, I think there is a lot of our sovereignty that has been lost. And the reason for losing that sovereignty is the reasons that Mahendra and Mr. Malia alluded to, which is the whole governance issue around this country. So with that comment, I'll pass you on to, I'll let Dhananath respond to the question.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Gunaruwan and Mr. Malia and everyone. Of course, I have a different view, and I'll try to convince both of them on my logic. I'll start with the cobras. So actually, if you think, who created cobras? It's the government. They tripled with a trigger of a wrong incentive system to triple the cobra population. And I'll come to the same argument with the sovereignty. I didn't say sovereignty is not important. Now, if you, let's get the real examples to the forefront. Now, by keeping the CEB and CPC on the government, who compromised the sovereignty? When the people died in queues, when people went through 12 hours of power cuts, which was completely run by government, do you think we had sovereignty? When the government was running it? Not at all. I mean, if there was a foreign invasion, the only way that we could have survived was switching off the lights, where, if you recall, during the LTT time, when they were striking attacks, the only thing that we did was we switched off the light in Colombo. That was the only strategy the CEB had if we were talking about the sovereignty during the electricity crisis. So by running by the state, it compromised the sovereignty. 100%. Do you think when people were dying in queues, do you think when even the A-level students couldn't study without electricity, we took the people of Sri Lanka's interest into the forefront? And the private sector will witness, when there was fuel crisis, the only source that the generators could have run was through IOC fuel, which they got on a private basis. We should not forget the principle here. Privatization is just part of the formula. What we are thinking about, setting up a market, privatization is just a part of it, because the failure of the government is much bigger than a failure of the private sector. It doesn't mean the private sector is all good and they are not corrupt. Of course, they are corrupt. We all know that. But the failure of the government is same as failure of CPC and CEB, which compromise our sovereignty, our people's lives, everything. But there are so many private companies which is closed down, and there are new private companies started. There's a mechanism. There's a mechanism. There's a demand and a supply curve that is working. So that's why we highlight the policy lens is based on principle. That's why even we never said privatization is the solution for all. And that's why I think Rehana's slide was very clear. There are some which are interested for the public sector, and she even highlighted out of the 520 odd, there are about, I think, 200 odd which are not non-commercial interests, but it was registered as a private sort of a corporation. So that's point number one. In terms of debt, though it is not related here, we all know who owns the debt. The debt, even if you look at the appropriation bill, the most of the payment were the interest payments. So the 6 billion has snowballed. The SOEs, what they borrowed, had to pay a market interest rate. And the best example is, I'm sure Mr. Fenando is here, on Sri Lankan Airlines. They are making an operating profit, but their interest payment for 1 billion, I think, for $1 billion of debt, you cannot cover it up. So basically the debt that we pay is not only the debt that is taken for investment. It is basically the snowballing effect. If I really recall, I can't recall the exact number, but I think about 88% or something is for the interest payment. And even in the appropriation bill, what we pay, the key component of the budget is the interest payment. It's not anything else. So the debt is snowballed by the interest, number two. Number three, I will also take up on the issue on, I think I spoke about the sovereignty, on the economic growth and this example of public transport as a private sector privatization failed effort. I think the public transport was not a privatization effort. That's why I said, don't forget the principles. We are talking about a market system. Is the public transport is a example for a market? I mean, if high influence person like if Mr. Mahendra buys a bus, can he field it at the route? No, because this is not a market, this is a mafia. Because you have to take a route permit, which you have to be connected to a politician, and I am also traveling by train and by bus quite often, and the route permit is expensive than the bus. I mean, how can that happen? How come the route permit is expensive than the bus, and there's a price control on the bus fare? And that's why if you go, the Jaffna buses which starts from Vallavatta is a better market system than the buses operating on the other side, because that doesn't adhere with the pricing system, and that works really well. I mean, you have to just give them a call, you can have the online booking, that markets work. That market is working, and that's why a lot of people go to Jaffna and coming back on the Vallavatta bus, and it has a schedule, and you can access it online. But it doesn't mean that there's no role for the government. there is a role for the government. They have to regulate. Of course, they can be the umpire or whatever that term. But it doesn't mean, the principle is if the government fails, that would be a much bigger disaster than a market failure. And markets have failed. It doesn't mean that the markets are working all the time. It is not. Definitely not. Markets are failing. But as I mentioned, the government failure, like what we saw on the CPCE, CEB, water board failure, it could be a much catastrophe for the common people, and at that point, we have to compromise the sovereignty. My last point on the economic growth and also the, on the economic growth and SOE reforms, I think we never said that privatization is the only solution. It has to be a overall. But on selecting the capacity, it was famously said, a lot of private sector people also have earned money by two ways. Either you sell a dirt cheap product at an exorbitant rate to the government, or you buy a very valuable thing from the government from a dirt cheap rate. So when you are trying to pick the that's why I said, I'm not saying the private sector is, I don't want to whitewash them. That's why I said, when you're selecting the capacity, the same problem could occur. And that's why we say, allow the market system to determine the price. And on Dr. Gunarwan's question, whether are we living in a market? Of course, yes, whether we like it or not. I'm not saying, I would be very happy if someone basically rules out everything. But the reality is quite different. We are living in a market system, but it's not perfect. I admit that. I mean, it's not fair. It has flaws. But we are looking at a best alternative available. So the best alternative available, when the governments have failed us miserably by running these state-owned enterprises, I mean, it's need to reform, definitely. And we always put the privatization, and don't forget, privatization is not a politician picking up a private company and handing it over. It should come through the market forces. You have to identify who is best, and on a pricing mechanism, because prices is a determinant of the scarcity value of the resources. That's how it should work, but I understand. There can be exceptions, there's political interference, which we all know. But compared to all the solutions available, this is the best alternative which is available.
Thank you, Dhananath. You put your hand up, madam. No, Ruan, that you have to take outside into the, whilst you're having tea. Yeah. The lady here wanted to make a comment, I think.
Good evening. First of all, thank you for this presentation and congratulations to the people behind the Public Reform Unit and the thinking that has gone into this. When I hear what everybody had to say, I can see that we are all thoroughly naked. You know, all of us have done wrong. You know, we have not served our country well. And I am thinking that these reforms are not going to happen overnight. They're going to happen over at least a decade. And we have to get the people behind us. And you brought that out. How do we get everybody engaged in this? Nobody knows the stories that you're telling. Nobody knows that state-owned enterprises have not been run well. People just see them as monoliths and that they exist. Their accounts should be debated by young students. You know, people should investigate and say, you know, Sri Lankan, the story that you told, Suresh, they need to understand that things are not going okay. Then only the pressure will come from the people to make changes. But otherwise, I don't see this happening. And I'm just hoping that you all are thinking of programs on how you can bring the people behind us, because I think it's a challenge to change. How do you ensure that that pressure is kept on? Not the IMF, not the world, but the people of Sri Lanka. My grandchildren, your grandchildren, you know, they must not look at us and say we didn't do anything. You know, how do we make sure that the pressure stays on?
So just to respond, one of the ways in which we want to get the debate around state-owned enterprises, and again, this is a policy recommendation that has been made, accepted by Cabinet. We want the SOEs to publish their accounts not just annually, but also quarterly, just like a listed company would do. So that again is a recommendation that we have made and has been accepted by Cabinet. Yeah, Ravi, you wanted to... Can hear you. Ravi, don't go ahead. You can be heard.
No, few things I think that need correction. One was a question as to, I think there was an estimate of $6 billion of SOE debt, and that would make up 10% of the foreign or the total external debt. Now, SOE debt is both a mixture of local debt and foreign debt. So if you look at our overall debt statistics, the foreign debt is only about half, or roughly around. That number depends on how you calculate it after the devaluation of the currency. So that's about half, right? But the other thing is the 54 or 60 billion of debt that is owed is all government debt, right? It's the government that has defaulted on the debts and is unable to service. It's not the private sector that's gone and defaulted on debt, right? So that has to be clear, right? Then the second is the reason you have accumulated all this debt is because you've been running deficits, and you have financed it by borrowing and by money printing. Thanks to the money printing, we are all much poorer today, and the fact that now you're belatedly waking up to the fact that you need to service debt, you're having to increase taxes, which makes us even poorer still, right? So, with regard to why the SOEs need to be restructured, the one reason why your government expenditure has grown so large is that you had 700 or 800,000 people in 2004, and today you have 1.5 billion in the public sector, right? And you have 600,000 pensioners. Now, either you have to, your biggest expense is the payroll, right? The next biggest expense is the interest cost to pay for your other expenditure, right? So restructuring debt is ongoing, but cutting the public sector payroll is a bit difficult to do. So you don't have too many options other than the SOEs.
Yes, Mr. Fenando, you want to?
Just want to make a few comments. Firstly, to note that this is a topic on which you can get sentimental and get carried away with various slogans about selling our properties here or assets. I don't think that is what is expected of a seminar. We are at this forum today because one of the biggest problems the country faces today, amid so many other problems, is the debt, is the SOEs and the loss they make on the budget, the impact on the budget. So that we can't continue to bear this over and again and turn around the economy. That is obvious. That is why these forums are arranged to discuss how we handle this thing. And privatization is not a very straightforward thing. Tomorrow, you have 530 odd state enterprises. I don't think your committee is going to take each one and then go on marketing them. You can't do it that way. I know at the periphery I have been involved with your work, and I know that you have divided the 534 into commercial, non-commercial, into ones that has a social content in the state, in the enterprise. They have a social role that they play. So you can't just forget that and privatize the. So you have gone through that analysis, and you're going to do it in an intellectual way where you don't take everything and just try to privatize. That you can't do. The second point is, even in privatization, in getting the party who is going to buy the thing, you must ensure that the party is capable of running that enterprise. You must ensure. Now, for instance, we had recently, or some time back, a proposal to bring in LNG and convert one of our powerhouses into the LNG with an American investor. Now, that American investor was not sought out, selected by a transparent process. It was brought by someone here with a deal, perhaps with a deal, into the country. If we, on the other hand, got a LNG operator, after scouting around and after getting proposals from people, that would have been a very good thing for the country. What is wrong with that? And I think the question of sovereignty is raised. What is sovereignty? Now, I take the case of Shangri-La. That property was owned by Sri Lankan government. Army was occupying that property. We sold the property to that investor, and he invested couple of billion US dollars in putting up that structure. And he is earning foreign exchange for the country and employed more than 1,000 people. Now, my sacrificing that land to that party, am I losing sovereignty? Is that a good project for this country? We could have had that land near Gulf Face to ourselves. But what does it generate to the future generation of this country? How do I balance my budget? What is the income that we get from that land? What is the potential value of that land? We have the coastline. I think many people, many in this audience may have gone to France, Greece, Turkey, and other places. If you see the coastline in those countries, they are all dotted by huge, the small chalets which are given out to tourists. And they earn massive amount through tourism. Now we have our beaches are 100 times better than those beaches. Now why can't we put up those chalets here? What is wrong in inviting a foreign investor to come here and put up a chalet, sell the land also? He's not going to take away the land. The one American president, when the state, that building was to be sold, what's it called? The state, the huge building in the US, I forget, Empire State Building. That was to be sold to a Japanese party and people protested. His answer was, Japanese will buy it, but the building will remain in the United States. What's the problem? Sovereignty I refine, not my owning every piece of land. Sovereignty is the right to govern your country, to make laws for the country. Even a foreigner who comes here has to obey those laws. And our parliament is supreme, and they have to follow those laws. That is sovereignty from a legal point of view. Sovereignty is not owning every inch of the land here. Someone else can own and contribute to the economy. But he will have to follow the laws of the country. And he will come by invitation, not by force. That is not a loss of sovereignty. So I think these are sentimental, emotional arguments which don't address the real issue. Our issue is and also we compared the 1.0 trillion debt of the of the SOEs, the loss, with 50 billion or 60 billion of our borrowings. Now the two are very different things. One is a loss made by the SOEs, the other is borrowings by the government. Then what? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so that is, what is the debt? The debt is borrowings by the government.
Let's have that. Gentlemen, let's have. Ruan, hang on.
SOE loss goes to the P&L of the government.
No.
No.
Yeah, yes.
So even the debt stock, that is money owed by the government SOEs to the government.
No, the point is SOE's total debt stock is 1.8.
Yeah, so I can't see the comparison between that, because these monies, the 50 odd billion, was borrowed by the government.
No, Ruan, hang on.
We are talking the debt of the 50 billion debt was borrowed by the government on projects on which the government people made money. All the highways that were done, except one, which was on open tender, all the others were unsolicited offers that were made to the government. On which one? What? No, what is wrong? What is wrong?
No, excuse, gentlemen.
No, whatever it is,
gentlemen,
the cost we have.
No, hang on. Hang on.
Please, let me finish.
Ruan.
RBI is government, no, really.
Mr. Fenando, one moment, please. Ruan, just to correct something, the SOE debt is not part of the government debt. It's not included in the total government debt.
Yeah.
Okay, SOE debt is separate to the government debt. So let's not compare the two, because they are not apples and oranges. So let Mr. Fenando finish.
Let me finish. You can answer later.
Listen, if you don't stop, I'm going to stop this session from now. No. So let's
You
have
can
that
let me
discussion
speak, and then
outside.
after
Let
that you
Mr.
can
Fernando
reply.
finish.
That is the gentlemanly way of doing it. Let me speak, and don't
Mr. Fernando,
interrupt.
do you have a lot more to say? Because this gentleman in front here also wanted to make some comments.
Yeah. So my position is that in privatization, we are going to address the issues of the need of the country. And if there are government entities which need government ownership, because you need not privatize every government entity. You can even take away the monopoly status of a government entity, like what happened in the telecom. We did not privatize the telecom. We only opened others to come in, and see what has happened. See what has happened today. When we entered law college, one of the lecturers used to say, you have entered law college today, please apply for the telephone, because by the time you pass out, you will get the connection. That is not the case today. So these are examples of what the state sector can do by unbundling this. And also the other issue is that in a company, you have three bodies: shareholders, the board, and the executive, and the management. The shareholders elect the board, which is really the trustees for the shareholders. And they appoint management. And there is a division of authority separation of powers between these three bodies. And there are checks and balances. That is what we call governance in the private sector. There are checks and balances within those three bodies, which doesn't give unfettered authority on one party. What happens in a SOE? SOE, the government owns the company on behalf of the people. No, not that they own personally. They on behalf of the people, and they appoint boards. How? Not on competence. They appoint board on political considerations. And therefore, the biggest factor that has failed the SOEs is management. That because they appoint, they are catchers, they are people in the electorate who support their voting, and those people run the office. And they appoint the chief executive, the chairman appoints. Then he is obligated to the chairman. Recruitments are made on a political basis. Expenditure procurement is done on that basis. So this, if you don't break this nexus between the board and the government, appointing the boards, and get good people who are responsible, who are answerable to the public, because they are the shareholders, not the government. Government is on behalf of the public. Unless you do that, we are not going to have a properly run entity as a SOE. That is why we had proposed that you have an independent holding company which has people of integrity who are known to this country with stature, and those people really implement the governance structures in a company. And the company board is accountable to that holding company with a yearly account of what they have to do with their objectives, and they have to earn, and those directors can be replaced if they don't perform. Yeah. That is the basis on which we... So I know I can speak. Just one point on the banking sector. I have been somewhat in the banking sector, and I must say that the point was made that private sector has no capital, and therefore they can't invest. That is why the state sector went into this. I don't think that is the case, because our banking sector has not supported investment. Even the two development banks are today commercial banks. Not because they were privatized, but because the act that really held those companies. I was chief executive of the NDB when it was privatized. We had the choice of doing away with the act which set up the bank and going under the Companies Act, because we had to be quoted on the stock exchange. We had the option of doing away with the act. I said no, keep the act, because the act specifies what our role is, that we should lend on long-term projects and so on, that is listed. But 5 years after I left, and during that 5 years, we increased our lending under private ownership. And we had a superb board, not people who were appointed by the government from various departments. Here, we had a superb board which directed the bank, and the lending increased. But 5 years after I left, the people who were in charge went to the government, and Mr. P.B. Jasundara was the secretary. They got the act removed. Now it is the board that runs. The board decides what to lend, and they have no long-term lending. And the long-term lending also another problem is...
Mr. Fenando, we are running short of time.
Yeah.
And
okay, I'll stop at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Sir, you had a question you wanted to.
This, SOE matter, I think that we should not, scale it down to privatization. It is much more bigger than that. I think we must look at restructuring the SOEs, not the privatization. But here we must look at as to why the government kept these institutions. One thing, in 1960s and 70s, we saw that government SOEs and the privatization is the answer for everything. We went up to the privatizing the Buhari Hotel and also establishing SOE for even to import gunny bags. So today, for last 40 years, we are talking now about privatization and the private investment. But for last 40 years, the privatization has not happened as we have intended. There are some reasons for that. One thing is, one major issue there is the staff or the workers of these institutions. For the consumers, the electricity if you take the electricity consumers, we don't mind that electricity is provided by the LECO or another company if it is at a reasonable price and reliable. But who are the people obstructing the privatization or restructuring? It is the employees, politicians, and the public servants. Because by keeping it under government, they can manipulate a lot of things. So, but for the people, it doesn't matter whether it is from the government or the private sector. Then, there must be a clear policy on privatization or restructuring these SOEs. I think I have seen that some people were questioning the present government, why they are privatizing the profit-making institutions like insurance corporation. Responding to that, I saw the President has said we are privatizing those things because we need money. But I think both are wrong. Just because we need money, we must not go privatization. Just because something is making loss, we should not go privatization. So solution may be somewhere in between. For the different categories of investments, there may be different solutions. So that another important factor what I can see in this whole affair, the price distortion in the market due to the SOEs and the subsidies. That's very serious issue. Today we cannot find what is the actual economic price of any product because of the subsidies and the SOEs. All the losses made by SOEs are really, those are subsidies. So any product, we can't find the actual economic cost of the production. I think that we must remove this price distortion, and for that, this privatization or restructuring of the SOE is one important aspect. But we should not, then one thing that this recently that government has started this privatize the petroleum. But there also I don't see the way that it is being done, whether it is correct. The more than the privatization, what we must look at is the way it is being done. That for last 40 years, why it has not happened? Because privatization itself became a corruption. Right throughout, from the beginning to today, it is a corruption. So we have not privatized anything according to accepted policy and programs. So therefore, I think privatization is a must, and also when you privatize, it is that there must be a principle. Why do we privatize? The government, I think the basic principle should be that anything that private sector can do commercially, the government should not do that. Let it be done by the private sector. But there may be certain things the private sector may not willing to do. So such things, at least initially, the government will have to do to set the example. Then, of course, later those can be privatized or allow the private sector to come in. Thank you.
Thank you. We are running short of time. Just take one more question if there is from the audience.
discussion that took place, it appears right.
We'll give them everyone. We'll give everyone a time to one last comment for the panelists, so they can cover some of these aspects.
Yeah.
They can respond to.
The name Temasek didn't come up in the discussion at all. Yeah, it must be there. So, is the Temasek model useful to us? Should we? I'm not saying that we should follow it, but are there any lessons to be learned? And then I'm asking the Director General of National Planning, what is the government doing about this holistic approach?
I think, we are talking about face meal now. SO is one of them. And also they highlighted the policy, the education and the skill, all link with everything. I think we have to look at entire country and holistically. Of course, SOE maybe today is the theme. But as a country, we have to have an overall policy framework for Sri Lanka where we are heading. And all are part of it. But national planning is a place to play a role, incorporating all the aspects. What is SOE, maybe the education reform and the skill sector. Apart from that, our export, what we want, and industrialization, energy, IT, all should come into the place. There is a link within the entire country. And national planning, of course, working with all the government entities and agencies, and also one of the policy making body in the government system. We have to work with every entity, not only the government itself, of course, private sector, civil society, and everyone, and to make it happen in Sri Lanka. That is my expectation, and we are working throughout. But it is not easy task, but we have to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, and make it, if you don't mind, make it short, please. We are already running out of time.
Now we have some experience in gas or petroleum. These are privatized. Now, for example, not privatized, petroleum corporation is there, but other companies are running. But price is fixed. Selling price is fixed. What is the meaning of privatization? Then gas. Gas also private sector also doing, but price is fixed by the government. Now, if you go for the electricity, if government is fix the price, what is the meaning of privatizing the electricity sector? So like that, we have to think about the competitiveness also. Without privatizing, with control of the prices, what is the meaning of the privatize? I think useless. We think about the losses of the organizations. But in other side, we have to think about. This is my question. Thank you.
I will respond to that very quickly before we start to wind up. Price controls and other types of regulations come when there aren't sufficient players in the market to provide citizens with the right quality of products, with decent pricing, availability, and so on. If there is sufficient competition in the market which protects consumer interests, then price controls are not necessary. On the other hand, if the number of players in the market are not sufficient to protect the consumer interest, that's where regulation comes in, and price control is part and parcel of that regulatory mechanism to prevent monopolistic or oligopolistic players making too much profit. That's the basic rationale. So with that, let's start winding up. It's already 10 to 7. Mr. Kumarsiri, very quickly, in 1 minute, you heard the audience, you saw the presentation. How do you sum up? Very, very quickly. 1 minute, please.
Yeah, I think we know the issues, challenges faced by Sri Lanka, especially the SOEs. There are a lot of talk, restructuring, privatization, whatever the name call. We have to revisit, revise the existing system to get maximum benefit to the Sri Lanka. That's
I think, that we have to take the overall picture rather than, sort of taking bits and pieces. Because we think that our markets are perfect. It is not. It is where the government has to intervene in a larger manner. So in an imperfect market, we cannot just look at one thing and say, okay, this is the responsible so and so, it has to be a collective approach. The other thing is that out of 520, the total loss incurred by 527 organizations, so is the 97% is coming from 3 organizations. Sri Lankan Air 60%, Petroleum Corporation 29%, 8% coming from CEB. So then are we going to take all the others to task for this? Now this is according to the Finance Ministry Annual Report 2021. 97% of the total losses of incurred by 527 organizations are coming from 3 organizations.
I prefer Dhananath to go first, and Rehana, since you made the presentation, you go back.
Since Dr. Lloyd spoke about the holistic approach, that's why I mentioned the holistic approach has to be, it's not the privatization or it's not anything else. I mean, those are part. It's looking at the market system. And that's where we should strengthen the market system. For that, the government has a role. Definitely they have a role. And it is the market system that establishes the prices. But having said that, as I mentioned, market system is not a perfect system, nor the government is perfect. But out of those, when you weigh it out, the failure of a government could be much more disastrous than a failure of a market. That's why we took at the policy lens of setting up a market system, and that's why we completely said it's privatization of course, having a government monopoly transferring to a private monopoly won't work, for sure. That's why we said it's a holistic approach has to be setting up the market system, and that's why we need more players, removing the regulations. That's the Cobra example came in, because you have to look at the winners and losers, both becomes the government's problem at the end of the day. That's why establishing the market is important. And finally, even in the Cobra's example, it's the government intervention which caused the problem, because they were just giving money from the taxpayer money as a government for killing cobras. That doesn't sustain. And even on the debt issue, that's why I said it's a snowballing of the interest, because when we were borrowing money to pay the interest, and this public debt, I think there's a definition issue, because there's government guaranteed debt and there's central government debt, and then that you combine it together is called the public debt, but there's also central government debt separately. So out of the SOE debt, there's some debt which is guaranteed by the state, which may come to the public debt, but some component may not come to the public debt. But when you borrow money to pay the interest, of course it's going to snowball. And that is where this 6 billion versus or whatever the number, why that's one reason we cannot come out from this debt cycle, and that was the main issue. That's why I said on a holistic point of view, that's why we said we are not saying to privatize all state-owned enterprises. Neither we are saying that, okay, don't keep anything to the government. We are saying look at where the markets work and making sure that the markets are working, and do not allow monopolies to work. A government monopoly or a private monopoly, both are equally bad. Setting up the market system is the best option. Of course, again, I reiterate, markets are not perfect, nor the government, but the failure of a government would be much catastrophic than a failure of a market, and that's why I stand for a market-based system, and that's why I stand for state-owned enterprises reforms.
Rehana, last words.
There was a question on Temasek. Actually, we have, in our most recent Advocata's report also, we have covered Temasek, but this presentation was based on a policy paper that we wrote for the foundation. So we did not talk about Temasek in that, but of course it is part of the whole process with respect to corporatization, all of that. So you can always refer the Temasek one as well. Yeah. Temasek and the Malaysian model, which is Khazanah. So both of those are holding companies. But overall, based on the whole conversation, I think the dominant theme of the corruption and governance was mentioned by the panelists as well as the audience members. I think it's important to take a step back and note that corruption is always in relation to the government. So the more opportunity that the government has to get involved in policy decisions, or whether it is giving a sand permit or a bus route permit, the more opportunity for corruption. So the whole idea behind what we are saying is to reduce the government's sort of footprint in a lot of these commercial activities so that you are taking away the opportunity for corruption. Because even I agree the private sector is corrupt. There's lots of issues. Even the common person is, I would say, a common person you take in Sri Lanka, I would say is highly corrupt, or they would support corrupt practices if they benefit from it. But what we are saying is that you reduce, because it's always in relation to the government. Whether you are paying a bribe to a police official, or whether you are influencing a minister by buying him a house or buying him a vehicle, that is all in relation to the government's dominant position in the economy. The government has the power to make so many decisions, and we have given the government that power. So what we are saying is, with SOE reform and with the larger reforms, is to, in terms of governance, to reduce the opportunity for corruption.
Thank you. So we've had a spirited discussion. We've had many views expressed. Not all views have been on the same lines, and that's fine, and I think that's the hallmark of a democracy. Just to add on a few words in terms of the job that I do and the reform process, the holding company model, you called it Temasek, which is a Singapore name. Yes, we've made the recommendation, and that also government has accepted. Cabinet has approved the forming of a holding company, and we are in the process of doing that at this moment. The ultimate aim of state-owned enterprise restructuring or reform, or whatever term you want to call it, is to ensure that the citizens of the country, the consumers, benefit through better quality goods and services, and through better pricing, and through more convenient availability. So we look at the different enterprises and we ask ourselves a very fundamental question. This enterprise will serve the consumer and the citizen better if it is in government hands, if it's controlled by government, or if it is in the hands of the private sector. And that is the basis on which that the next steps are taken. So we go on the very, very basic principle that when any one of us in this room, all of us buy soap. When we buy soap, we don't look at who manufactures the soap or who owns the company that makes the soap, but instead we buy it on the basis of how good the soap is, what price do we pay for it, can we get it easily or not. These are the principles, the fundamental principles that we follow in terms of SOE restructuring as well. So the intention is to provide the citizens of the country a better quality product or service, better pricing, and better availability. And as a part of that process, there may be certain enterprises that serve the interests of the citizen better in private hands, and then they will be moved to private hands. If, on the other hand, the interest of the citizen is better served by that enterprise being under government control, then it will remain under government control. And the policy paper that we have presented to Cabinet and approved by Cabinet tells us, gives us a way forward in how those enterprises that remain under government will be managed, and managed in a way that consumer interest is served, and those enterprises will no longer be a drag on the country's fiscal operations and on the country's economy. So with those few words, let me hand you back to the organizers, and thank you very much for inviting all of us.
Thank you very much, Session Chair, Mr. Suresh Shah, for conducting that session. In order to conclude today's session, there are a few announcements. Our session number 12 will be on November 3rd at 4:30, same hall. It will be on environment by Professor Ajit Dialvis. And moving on, we have the Frida Korea Award that's going to happen on December 8th, where we honor inspiring women who have overcome poverty through family empowerment, and they're going to share their stories and create awareness. And we would like you to get involved in this as well. There's a number where you can contact Ms. Shirani Disanayaka to get further information, or you can go to our website and under Frida Korea Awards. So it has come down to me to give the vote of thanks as the consultant of the Sri Lankan Innovators Forum. I would like to thank our distinguished guests who are here today, spending their valuable time, and in order to express my deepest gratitude to the eminent speaker and the panelists, Mr. Dhananath, Fenando, and Rehana, Thowfeek. Thank you very much for being here with us and presenting your paper. It was very thought-provoking and a fine balance between social rates of return and profitability. I think it's very essential for SOE sector liberalization. So you have shed light on crucial matters which were discussed today, and thank you very much. And I would like to specially thank Mr. Suresh Shah for his expertly guiding this process and proceedings to ensure a smooth flow of this discussion. And last but not least, I would like to thank Mr. Mahendra Jayasekara, who just left, and Mr. Kumarasi and Mr. Chandrasena Madhyadda for sharing their valuable expertise and engaging a meaningful discourse. I would also like to thank our chairman, Gamini Korea Foundation, the CEO and the directors for helping us organizing this, and also our staff who has worked tirelessly to organize this event. And thank you very much, and I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you. Refreshments will be served outside.